On this video, I would like to continue in Revelation chapter 18, and we're in chapter 18, verse 17. And I'm looking at the Greek text, reading it and doing a grammatical analysis, and then commentary. In this chapter, we're looking at the demise or downfall of Rome. John is predicting it with an amazing prediction as to what happened. And it happened after John had predicted it, of course, and it's looking at a miraculous, I guess you would say, prophetic prediction of Rome's downfall. So I'm picking it up where there's this constant weeping by the merchants who have gotten rich from Rome, because now she is going to be desolate. And so we begin where we left off in verse 17. Kai pas gubernates kai pas ha epitapan pleon kai nautai kai hasoiten thalasan ergadzantai apa mekrathen hestesan. That is, as we look at this text, and every ship, one that governs a ship, is really the meaning of the word here. Every ship governor, so to speak, one who is the pilot or who guides the ship. So every pilot, every ship pilot is now going to be weeping, and everyone who has basically been seafaring, literally everyone who is sailing on the sea, every seafaring men, kaihasoit, and all who work on the sea, are now going to be crying out. So we have as many as ergadzantai are working the sea from afar. Hestesin, they stood, and they are crying. Notice ergadzantai is your present indicative active, middle, third person plural from ergadzamai. So as many as are working on the sea are crying, and they're crying out because their wealth has been lost. And notice they stood from afar. Hestesan is from histemi. It is the aorist indicative active third person plural from histemi. And they were crying. They were beginning to cry. Ekradzan blepantes tan kapnantes purosaos autes legantes. They were crying, or they were crying out. It's like they were beginning to cry out as they were seeing. Blepantes is your present participle, nominative masculine plural from blepo, as they were seeing the fruit of its burning, as they saw as they saw the smoke, kapnan, of its burning, saying. So they're crying out as they're seeing the smoke of its burning, tis hamoya te pale te megale. What city was like this great city. Legantes, again, is your present participle nominative masculine plural from Lego. So they were crying out, saying, what city is like this great city? And then in verse 19, it continues, Kai ebalan kun epitas kefalas auton, kai akradzon klai antes, kai penthuntes legantas, or legantes. So they were crying out, and they were they put dust upon their heads. Aorist indicative active third person plural from balo. And they were crying from kradzo. It's your imperfect indicative active third person plural. They were crying, weeping, kleiontes, and sorrowing. They were weeping and sorrowing. Kleiontes is from kleio. It's the present nominative participle, nominative plural from kleio. They were crying and they were mourning. Penthuntes is from pitheo, present participle, nominative masculine plural, saying, alas, alas, uai, he pales, he megale, alas, alas. For the great city, speaking of Rome here, by which eplute pantes hoi ekantes, ta ploia in te thalase ectes timiatetas autes. For all those who were having ships got rich. Epluteson is from pluteo, aorist indicative active third person plural. They all who were having ships got rich in the sea out of her wealth. In other words, Rome made it possible for them to become rich. But in 1 hour, hate mia ora eremose. In 1 hour, it has been laid waste. In other words, the wealth that they had received in 1 hour now, it is laid waste. They're no longer able to experience the wealth that they had experienced. And so they're crying out because their wealth has been lost. Eremose is your aorist indicative passive from eremao, to lay waste. So in verse 20, we then continue, Euphrainu ep aute uranet. However, to John, it's not sorrow, it's rejoicing. So rejoice over her, O heaven. Kai hoi hagioi, kai hoi apostoloi, kai hoi prophetai. That is, and rejoice over her, O heaven, O saints, and apostles, and prophets. For God has judged hate eklenan hata as takrima humon ex autes. For God has judged, literally the idea is given judgment for you against her. In other words, God has judged your judgment out of her. Euphrainu is an imperative. Notice in verse 20, it's the present middle imperative from euphrainamai. So rejoice over her, O heaven, and saints, and apostles and prophets, because God has judged with your judgment out of her. In other words, bringing judgment on her is helping to judge what they've done to you. It seems to be the idea. Eklinen is your aorist indicative active third person singular from krino, to judge. So then we continue in verse 21. Ke eren es angelas iskuras lithan hos mulinan megan, kai ebalen es tain thalasan legon. So a mighty angel took up a stone. Eren is from airo, aorist indicative active third person singular, took up a stone like a great millstone, as a mulinon megon, and cast it into the sea. Ebalin is your aorist indicative active third person singular from balo. Cast it into the sea, saying, Legon is just your present active participle nominative masculine singular. Hutos or memati blethesetai babulon he megale palis kai ume hurethe eti. Thus shall Babylon the Great be thrown down with violence. Thus, with violence, Babylon the Great city, Blethesetai, shall be thrown down. Again from Balo, future indicative passive, third person singular. Kai ume hurethe eti, and shall not be found in her again. There shall not be found in her, shall be found in her no more. In other words, violence will be found in her no more. She is thrown down. This is from Heurisco, aorist passive subjunctive third person singular from Heurisco. And so we continue in verse 22, describing all the musicians, minstrels, flute players that will not be found there again. Kai phone kitharodon, kai musikon, kai auleton, kai salpiston, ume akuste insoi eti. And the sound of those that play the harp, of harpers and minstrels, musicians, and of flute players and trumpeters. So musikon kai auleton, of flute players, kai salpiston, and of trumpeters, me akuste insoi eti, shall never be heard in you again. Notice here, akuste is from akuo. Again, it is the aorist passive subjunctive third person singular from akuo. Shall never be heard in you again. And furthermore, and every craftsman, kai pas technites, passes technes, every craftsman of every craft, of any craft, shall be found, me hurethe in se eti, shall never be found in you again. Notice here, ume here is a double negative, and hurethe is from heurisco, aorist subjunctive passive, shall never be found in you again. And furthermore, kai phone mulu, and the voice of the mill shall be heard in you no more. I think the mill that implies the millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. Ume akuste insoi eti, from akuo, aorist subjunctive passive, third person singular, shall not be heard in you again. Furthermore, kai phos lupnu ume phane insoi eti, and the light of a lamp shall no more shine in you. Phine is from phino, the aorist subjunctive active third person singular, shall no more shine in you. Kai phone numpheu, nor or and the voice of the bridegroom, kai numphes, and the bride, ou me akuste in soi ete, shall not be heard in you anymore. Akuste is your aorist passive subjunctive from akuo. Because your merchants were great men of the earth. Hate hoi em poroisu e san hoi magistanes tes gates. That is, your merchants were the great men of the earth that basically sold and traded. Asan is your imperfect indicative active third person plural from emi, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. Hate ente pharmakeasu, by your magic and sorcery, eplanethesan pantata ethne, all nations were deceived. Here we have planeo. It's the aorist indicative passive third person plural. So all nations were deceived by your pharmakeia. Interesting. The word pharmakeia um, is sort of an interesting word. It means use of drugs, either as medicine, poison, or magic, possibly. But at any rate, we could translate it magic or sorcery, I think. Kai enaute chaima propheton kai hagion hurethe. And in her, that is in Rome, the blood of the prophets and of the saints was found. Now we're coming to what Rome had done and what they were about. Eurethe is the aorist indicative passive third person singular from heurisco. So the blood of the prophets and saints was found, and of all those who have been slain upon the earth. Kai panton ton esphagmenon epi tes gates. Here we have esphagmeno is the perfect passive participle from sphagzo, to slaughter or kill. The perfect passive participle genitive plural from sphago. So again, sphazo. So again, we're looking at the violence that characterized Rome, and how uh, what we're seeing here is basically its final demise, its final downfall. One of the things that I've said throughout this video taping, I've really appreciated Metzger in a lot of his comments. And it's interesting on page 87, and this is the book Breaking the Code Again. He made the statement, the chapter concludes with a remarkable passage that describes with haunting power the tragic end of the city. In contrast to her former festivity, the daily activity of her busy artisans, and her domestic labors and joy, now all is silence and desolation and ruin. The dirge concludes with the explanation that Rome is to be destroyed because of the blood of the prophets and saints whom she has caused to be slaughtered, martyred. It is implied because they had refused to take part in emperor worship, or the worship of the emperor god. As we had said in a previous video, this is a prediction that took place in the fateful week of August in the year 410, when Alaric, with his northern hordes of Goths, pillaged Rome and laid it waste.
What's the date? August.
And the date is August in the year AD 410. So I appreciate again, as I come to the conclusion of this chapter, I'm quoting again what Bruce Metzger said at the end of his brief commentary on page 87 and 88 in Breaking the Code. He wrote, what do we learn from this part of the book of Revelation? Certainly, John wrote in order to stimulate faithfulness on the part of persecuted Christians living in the first century. He assures them of the ultimate victory of Christ. But Revelation also has a warning for believers down through the years. Babylon is allegorical of the idolatry that any nation commits when it elevates material abundance, military prowess, technological sophistication, imperial grandeur, racial pride, and any other glorification of the creature over the Creator. In these chapters, we have an update portrait of what may occur when we idolize the gross national product, worship growth, and become so preoccupied with quantity that we ignore quality. The message of the book of Revelation concerns the character and timeliness of God's judgment, not only on persons, but also of nations, and in fact of all principalities and powers, which is to say, all authorities, corporations, institutions, structures, bureaucracies, and the like. And in the extent, and to that extent, he writes, that ecclesiastical denominations and sects have succumbed to the lure of power and prestige. The words of John are then applicable also to present-day church structures. So I thought that was an interesting application that Metzger made at the end of this study concerning this chapter. I would like to also say that I think as we think through the book of Revelation, that Rome, I believe, all the way through can become a type of the world system as a whole that will finally be defeated and judged at the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so I think the book will go on to describe that glorious coming and the final judgment, which will bring forth a new heaven and new earth. And so I think the encouragement is to be faithful, to do what the Lord wants us to do today, and to serve Jesus Christ, for he is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords.